The Ryzen 7000 series are here, and while the majority of you will want to see how the high-end Ryzen 9 parts do in terms of performance, the average consumer is still going to end up buying a mainstream part, like the Ryzen 5 series of processors. Now, if history has taught us anything, the Ryzen 5 3600X and Ryzen 5 5600X were extremely popular, so it makes sense that the new Ryzen 5 7600X will follow that trend. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video's sponsor. I wish these files would transfer faster. Come on! Whoa, is that the FireStrike 510 NVMe drive with its blistering fast speeds of 3450 megabytes a second read, 3200 megabytes a second write, and capacities of up to 2 terabyte? I can have these files transferred in no time. And if I'm looking for the ultimate performance, I could even get the 4th generation FireStrike 520. I better check the link in the description to find out more details. Now, a quick caveat before we delve into the Ryzen 5 7600X, but we do have other content available on the other SKUs that are being released, so definitely check them out on both eTeknix.com in written form or on our channel. Now, the 7600X from a core and thread standpoint when compared to its predecessor has actually seen nothing change, but as we drill down a little further, the changes become a bit more evident. Not only have we seen a huge increase in base clock speed from 3.7 GHz up to 4.7 GHz, the boost clock has also taken a healthy increase too, from 4.6 GHz on the 5600X to 5.3 GHz on the 7600X, showing us that even the lesser high-end parts have not been forgotten about, and at least on paper, mean business. Now, it doesn't just stop there, as we also see the L2 cache now doubled from 3 meg to 6 meg, Radeon graphics embedded directly into the chip, though it's more aimed at desktop graphics opposed to gaming, and of course support for both DDR5 and PCI Express 5. Not that we have any devices on the market just yet. So all of this is thanks to the new TSMC 5nm process node that the core is made from, which also sees IPC improvements by up to 13%, which all sounds well and good, but there is, however, a less favourable update, shall we say, where we see the default TDP of the 7600X being increased from 65 watts on the Ryzen 5 5600X to 105 watts. What that means in terms of temperatures and efficiency, we will actually be finding out later on. While the performance should in theory be better, we have to ask if that's worth sacrificing in other areas, like thermals for instance. Now at this point, you've probably seen tons of images and videos on the processor's design, but it's still worth kind of commenting on, as this is the first time we've seen a completely new IHS design from AMD since 2003. And while I did fear that thermal paste getting into the grooves would be a bit of an issue, after testing, I actually found that to be a complete kind of non-issue. So hopefully that at least puts your mind at ease, if that was, some cause for concern. Now, one area that, at least in my eyes, was a cause for concern came down to the pricing. When the Ryzen 5 3600X launched back in 2019, it did so with an MSRP price of $249. The next gen 5600X launched at a slightly higher $299, but it offered a very large jump in performance that warranted the extra cost. Now, my fear now is that with the Ryzen 5 7600X coming in at the same $299 price tag, how much extra performance are we really going to see? So speaking of performance, let's jump into it. And with any new platform, we had to create a new fully fledged test system, comprising of a Gigabyte Aorus X670E master motherboard with the 813B BIOS. We also used 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR5 5200 MHz memory that we've been using for our Alder Lake testing, which then allows us to compare directly in the fairest way possible. To keep the CPUs cool, we're using the NZXT Kraken Z73 RGB AIO cooler, and to cast any doubt of bottlenecks, we're using a Seagate FireStrike 530 1TB NVMe drive to store our applications and games. For all of our testing, we're using the Zotac RTX 3090 Trinity, and resizable bar is enabled along with XMP. Our whole system is housed inside the NZXT H7 Flow chassis to represent true world performance, and all power figures and temperatures are measured using HW Monitor, though we will be moving to the Elmore Labs PMD USB in the near future for kind of a more set of accurate results. For our game data, all results are recorded using CatFrameX version 1.6.9, and while we do everything in our power to make things as fair as possible, due to the fact that the 7600X utilises DDR5 and the AM4 test system uses DDR4, there will be some variances that are out of our control. So, with that out of the way, let's get into the benchmarks. Starting things off with SuperPi, and straight away we can see that the 7600X in comparison to its predecessor, the 5600X, has seen just over a minute shaved off the total calculation time. Compared to the 12600K from Intel, the 7600X has now further cemented its lead, as the 5600X was already a few seconds quicker to start with. What is interesting here is that the 7600X is now the fastest CPU we've tested in SuperPi. In wPrime, we again see some healthy gains in the 32 million calculation test over both the 5600X and 12600K, and this is further cemented in the 1024M test, where we see a dramatic difference in the calculation time that actually sees the 7600 faster than the likes of the 5800X 3D. Taking a look at compression, and in the 7-zip benchmark we again see some pretty strong results compared to the 12600K and its previous generation part, the 5600X. In fact, the compression result here is only just behind the 5800X 3D, and we find similar results in the decompression test too, only being beaten by much higher skew parts. Due to the fact that AM5 uses DDR5, the only real basis we have is compared to other AM5 based processors that we've tested and Intel's Alder Lake based products, along with seeing what kind of uplift we have over AM4's DDR4 performance. Straight away we do see a performance uplift in terms of bandwidth over AM4 of around 14% when comparing to the 5600X and the 7600X. And while this is welcomed, Intel definitely still hold the upper hand. When looking at the write speeds, and though we tested multiple times, it seems that some of the 3000 and 5000 series processors have some kind of theoretical maximum throughput on the memory controller, hence identical results. And due to this, we see a huge 140% gain in performance when moving to the 7600X, though lower end processors like the 12100F from Intel still managed to push ahead by around 6%. In the copy portion of the test, we again see a strong performance gain, this time of just over 25% when comparing like for like on the 5600X to the 7600X. Again, Intel push ahead more and show that bandwidth is big business for the 12th generation of CPUs. When we look at the latency, this is where things get a bit closer between the AMD 7600X and Intel's 12th gen, with some slightly stronger numbers in favour of AMD, as the Intel 12600K is around 6% slower overall. Due to the fact that the 5600X is on AM4, which only supports DDR4, of course we do see some better numbers compared to the 7600X, but a faster memory kit may make a difference here instead. Moving over to rendering performance, and in Blender we see a pretty solid 38% lead over the 5600X, though performance on the 7600X does sit just below the 12600K, but also shows a decent uplift over higher core count processors from the previous generation, much like the 5800X 3D. Within Cinebench R23 single core performance, we see a strong uplift in performance over the previous generation 5600X of around 27%. When compared to the 12600K from Intel, the 7600X does come out on top, but it's only by around 2%. In terms of multi-core performance, we see slightly stronger performance with a 35% lead over the 5600X, though the 12600K still has stellar performance over the new SKU with a 14% lead. In Corona, the 7600X shows some strong gains compared to the 5600X by coming in 24 seconds faster to render, though does still sit around 5 seconds slower than the Intel 12600K. Looking at rays per second, we can see a clear 25% improvement in performance moving from the 5600X to the 7600X. But again, the 12600K from Intel does still manage to push ahead by 5% overall. In Keyshot Viewer, where performance is based on multiples of render time on their reference system, the 7600X ends up taking a sizable lead of 29% over the 5600X. But sadly it's not enough, as again the 12600K just manages to push ahead by around 5% over the 7600X. In the last of our render-based tests, V-Ray showed a nice performance leap of 37% from the 7600X when comparing against its predecessor, the 5600X. Though again, that 12600K from Intel proves to be too strong and pushes ahead, albeit only by 1.7%. In 3D Mark FireStrike, we see a similar increase in performance that we've been continuously seeing, with the 7600X pushing around 8.5% ahead of the 5600X, which was already slightly ahead of the 12600K from Intel to start with. In 3D Mark Timespy, the 12600K is near the top of our chart and pushes ahead of the new Ryzen processor by 7%. We do still see an uplift from the 5600X of 4%, but it's not really enough to push closer to Intel's Alder Lake equivalent. When looking at single core performance in Geekbench, the 7900X shows some impressive performance over the 5600X of 31%, and a lower but still impressive 10.8% over the 12900K. With such a strong emphasis on single core performance in games, could this be the sign of what's to come in our gaming testing? We'll find out soon. Moving on to multi-core performance, and we see a huge leap of over 40% when comparing the uplift from the 5600X to the 7600X, though performance does fall slightly behind the 12600K, with it taking a 9.2% lead over the new Ryzen processor. In PC Mark 10 Express, we again see the 7600X with a decent uplift over the 5600X by 16.8%. And compared to the 12600K, we see a healthy 12% lead from the 7600X. But that's not the big news here. What we actually find here is the sheer clock speed of the 7600X and 7900X, for that fact, topping our charts where it really matters for this test. Taking a look at web browser performance and kicking things off with Google Octane, and we see similar gains to what we've already seen so far, with a 26% lead over the 5600X. In terms of relative performance to the 12600K, we do see the 7600X push ahead by just under 5% overall, and while the 12900K does beat the 7600X, it's only by less than 2%. In Mozilla Kraken, the 7600X comes in at 375.6 milliseconds, which is around 21% faster than what we saw from the 5600X, and around 10% faster than the 12600K. In fact, the 7600X did so good here that it was actually just under 5% faster than the Core i9-12900K flagship from Intel, and only fell just behind the slightly beefier 7900X. In WebXPRT, we again see some really strong performance from the new Ryzen 7000 series, with the 7600X sitting near the top of our chart, only being beaten by the 7900X. While it could be argued margin of error, the 7600X comes in just ahead of the 12900K, but does sit 7% ahead of the 12600K, and 21% ahead of the 5600X. As we know, Assassin's Creed Valhalla doesn't really make a huge difference in the average FPS, and that's why we only see less than a 1% improvement over the 5600X, which could be argued, I guess, as margin of error. Though we do see a 7% uplift in performance when looking at the 1% lows, which will provide a better and more fluid gaming experience overall. In Cyberpunk, we see a 21% improvement generation on generation, and also see around a 22% uplift in the 1% lows. And while it's impressive, still not enough to overthrow the 12600K from Intel, which pushes ahead by just under 2% in comparison to the 7600X. F122 sees a 6% performance improvement over the 5600X, which, while it's nice to see, it's not enough to even get close to that of the 12600K from Intel, which ends up 8% ahead of the 7600X, though does suffer slightly in the 1% lows in comparison. FarCry 6 sees another healthy gain in performance when comparing the 5600X to the 7600X, with a 17% increase in performance at 1080p. Compared to the 12600K, the 7600X does come out on top, though there is only 1% in it, so could be argued, again, as margin of error. Forza shows similar gains with the 7600X pushing ahead by 17%, again generation to generation. And while the 12600K does draw closer, the 7600 is still ahead by 7.6%. Horizon Zero Dawn doesn't show anywhere near the same improvements, where the 7600X only increases performance over its predecessor by 1.6%, and a much smaller 0.4% over the 12600K. Though at 245 FPS, it's not something you're going to notice when playing a title like this anyway. Microsoft Flight Sim really loves that stacked cache of the 5800X 3D, which sees it fly to the top of our charts, followed behind by the 7600X, which comes in higher than the 7900X by 4%, and a whopping 20.5% higher than the 12600K. When it comes to the average FPS in Red Dead Redemption, there isn't much to talk about, as the increase in performance over the 5600X and 12600K is negligible. But what is interesting is where we see the 1% lows push forward, giving us a much smoother gameplay experience and less dips overall. Much like with our 7900X content, we noticed a slight anomaly in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the Ryzen 7000 series processors underperform what we'd expect, and we're hopeful that this will be fixed in an update from the developer. Finally, in Watch Dogs Legion, we continue to see the trend with a 20% improvement over the 5600X, though the uplift isn't enough to fend off the 12600K, as it sits just 1 FPS behind in both average FPS and the 1% lows. So with all the games tested, the easiest way to look at gaming performance is to look at the overall average FPS. And I'll be honest, I never expected it to be this close with the 7600X and the 12600K nigh on identical, albeit with the 7600X coming in 1 FPS better in the 1% lows. Now, the key metric that we have to look at here is the increase in performance, moving from the 5600X to the 7600X, where it leads by just over 8%, which is nothing to grumble about, but I was just expecting something more. Now, with any new product, you're always going to be expected to pay a premium as a new adopter, and that's pretty evident here for the most part. where we actually see the 7600X costing around $2.03 per frame, which is slightly above the 12600K, which perform basically the same. The older but lesser performing 5600X comes in quite a bit cheaper at $1.49 per frame, so I guess it all comes down to personal choice. Now in the UK it's a similar story, though we see a little bit more alignment between the 7600X and 12600K, coming in with the same cost per frame overall. Intel and AMD's higher end still comes in more expensive, while the mid-range 5600X comes in with a pretty reasonable £1.09 per frame. But the 12100F still offers the best value for money at 59 pence per frame. Taking a look at power consumption, and while the 7600X does improve at idle in comparison to the 5600X, it actually uses more power during gaming and during our Cinebench run as well. The saving grace is while performance across our benchmarks was very similar to the 12600K, it actually uses significantly less power during workload related tasks, but the Intel CPU still beats it during gaming. Now with an average cost of 15.42 cents a kilowatt hour in the US, the 7600X actually comes in slightly cheaper at idle to run per hour than the 5600X and 7600X. With an average cost of 15.42 cents per kilowatt hour in the US, the 7600X comes in slightly cheaper at idle to run per hour than the 5600X, but it does fall a little bit behind in both gaming and workload related tasks. Obviously this isn't a huge amount when looking at the difference, but still a point that needs raising overall. The other point to focus on is that during workload related tasks like Cinebench, we do actually find the 7600X costing less to run than the 12600K from Intel. In the UK, where electricity costs are much higher with an average of 34 pence a kilowatt hour, we see a similar trend, with the 7600X costing less to run at idle, but more in both gaming and workload related tasks when compared to its predecessor. Idle aside, due to the E-cores from Intel, we do see the 12600K and the 7600X both winning this battle in one area each. So performance is one thing, but temperatures play a big factor too, especially with the 7000 series getting a lot of bad press regarding how high they can go, and it was no exception for the 7600X. At idle, along with the 7900X, it was one of the hottest chips we've tested, and the same can be said for our gaming load test too. The big one, however, was during our Cinebench R23 load test, where we saw the temperatures rise up to 93.6 degrees, which was 18% higher than that of the 12600K, though Intel's 12900K still took the crown here at 100 degrees during gaming load. So as always, a ton of stuff to talk about and a lot of data to chew through, and also some information on what's next for our Ryzen 7000 series coverage. Now when I first caught wind of the Ryzen 7000 series of processors, much like anyone, I was keen to see what the high-end 7900X and 7950X were going to be like. But for the most part, like the average consumer out there, I wanted to see what was kind of going on at the mainstream end of the spectrum. It's a much harder market to crack when variance between products is so much smaller. What I'm trying to say is that you can only put so much focus on performance before the product starts pushing into a higher bracket of pricing. So I guess AMD had to be careful when trying to beat the 12600K, and obviously improving on the 5600X without going a bit too far. Otherwise, the likes of the 7700X would be deemed redundant. So I guess out of all of the new lineup in the Zen 4 range, the 7600X probably has it the toughest, as it has to win in so many different areas, and sadly, it does actually fall short in some of them. Now I mentioned that pricing was a big one for me, as it's coming in at exactly the same price as the 5900X did when that launched, and at $299, well, it's not a bad price based on performance and does offer up a decent amount of uplift in performance over the 5600X. I was actually expecting a little more in certain areas, whereas other areas it actually did extremely well. I mean, productivity wise, I have no qualms about it. For the most part, it was either neck and neck with the 12600K or slightly behind. And I'm okay with that because it's in the same ballpark, and that makes it at least at face value competitive. Now when it came to gaming, it was a real interesting one where, depending on the title, we see it either decimating the 12600K and in some cases coming very close, or beating the higher end 12900K, or we just see it falling short behind the 12600K, making it a real kind of frustrating situation for me to judge, purely based on a value for money aspect. Now, the best way of kind of drilling down performance, at least from a gaming perspective, is to look at the overall average FPS. And that just makes it even more difficult because it performed exactly the same as the 12600K, albeit with a 1 FPS better 1% low score over the average of 10 games. The saving grace is that compared to the 12900K, it's also very similar in performance, with the 12900K only sitting around 1.5% ahead of it, but obviously costing a lot more money. So at the end of it all, the 12600K is the slightly better value chip, but it's been out a lot longer too, so it's kind of had a chance for pricing to stabilise, and at the time of making this content, the US dollar rate is all over the place compared to the pound, and yeah, that just goes kind of against AMD right now. Now the biggest issue that AMD have is with the 7600X and the fact that it performs the same as the 12600K for the most part. And it actually costs around the same, albeit coming in around £10, $10 more. So it's already kind of on the back foot. And we all know that Intel's 13th generation of processors are right around the corner. And I feel that's going to hurt the 7600X quite badly, depending on its performance and pricing. AMD just needed to do, I don't know, a little more in my opinion. And now it's kind of too late. So don't get me wrong, the 7600X is a great chip. It gives you great performance across productivity and workload related tasks, and of course, during gaming. The big issue right now is that it's a new platform. It means buying a new chip, a new board, new memory, just to get it functioning. And that comes at a premium. And for a similar premium, you could go Intel. Now, there is one thing that I guess goes extremely in AMD's favour, and that comes down to the platform. Once you buy a 7600X, you're good to go for years to come. Whereas the 12600K is about to be obsolete in one sense of the word. The 13th generation of processors are coming and will likely be better and will likely cost more money, whereas AM5 as a platform will accept newer processors beyond that in the future. So it all comes down to if you're buying for the here and now or if you're buying for the future as well. A kind of bittersweet conclusion for the 7600X. While I'm trying to find a slightly brighter silver lining, that's all I've pretty much got. Is it enough to sway me? Maybe just. And if the price comes down slightly like we saw on the 5600X, then definitely. It could go down as one of the greatest processors in the lineup. But for now, it just has too many factors against it, bringing it kind of down, even if it does offer extreme performance. I don't know, let me know, do you agree with what I'm saying? Maybe I'm completely off the mark. Either way, I'd be interested to kind of see what you guys say, so leave a comment down below. With that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you get access to all the charts and all the data for this processor and also the 7900X. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.